Food is all around us. It's no longer just in our kitchens and restaurants. It's on our phones, Instagram, YouTube. We use food as a reason to get together, celebrate, and experience. No matter if that experience is in your home or in a different city. I am your host, Scott Scher, and I'm here to talk about your favorite food and the people behind them. This is the I'd Eat That podcast.
For most people who are cooking with cannabis, they're going to burn the terpenes off when they're making the butters or oils. The terpenes are not going to help anybody. That's why I removed them. And then, by the way, in my cookbook I teach you how to remove the majority of those compounds.
Thank you for joining me on episode 14 of the I'd Eat That podcast, the food podcast that interviews food people. Today we have JeffThe420Chef joining us. He is the author of the 420 Gourmet cookbook that specializes in cannabis recipes. He will talk to us about cooking with cannabis. Let's talk to Jeff to learn more. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining me on the I'd Eat That podcast. Today we have JeffThe420Chef joining us today. How are you doing today?
I'm doing fantastic. How are you?
Good. Did you have a good weekend?
I did. It's very good. Busy, but good.
Good. Glad to hear it. So how long have you been experimenting with cooking with cannabis?
I've been cooking with cannabis for 10 years, professionally for about 7.
Wow, very cool. Is there anything that you need to do with cannabis before you start cooking?
Yes. I mean, a lot of cannabis chefs out there will cook with distillates or isolates, and they'll mix them into their oils or into their recipes, to create either a can of oil or a can of butter that they can then work with. I work with the flour, and before I even get to that point, I take the flour and I put it through a process that removes all the compounds responsible for the odor and taste. So when I make my can of oils and can of butters and tinctures and sugars and whatever else I'm making, to cook with, I'm actually using a plant material that still maintains the potency of the THC, but does not have any of the compounds responsible for the odor and taste. So all of my edibles do not have the cannabis taste in them.
Very interesting. So you were talking about the cannabis taste. How does cannabis influence flavors in food?
Yeah, it's a great question. If you use cannabis the right way in your recipes, it can actually complement the flavor. So if I want to have the cannabis taste in my food, I'll use raw bud or raw flower. But when you're cooking with cannabis, you've got to be really careful because the terpenes in the flour itself combust at a very low temperature. Some of them even start to, combust and denigrate at 70 degrees. So when you, really get cooking with cannabis, and you're hitting up into the 300s and the 325s and 350s, which are, standard cooking temperatures, you're really burning away your terpenes. And what you're really tasting in your cannabis-infused edibles is a taste of burnt terpenes. It's not even the actual terpene. And, if people want to test it on their own, they can use a strain, for example, like forbidden fruit. And if you were to use forbidden fruit, which has a very, very distinct odor and flavor profile, if you were to use that in the same way and make, your can of oil or can of butter, your can of oil and can of butter are not going to taste like forbidden fruit. They're going to still have that cannabis, weedy taste that people talk about. And what that taste really is a taste of the burnt terpenes and the chlorophyll. It has nothing to do with the actual terpene flavors that were existing before you put it through the cooking process.
Oh, very interesting. I've heard of cannabis cookies or brownies or gummies, but besides baked goods and desserts, can you use cannabis in cooking other things like meat or vegetables?
Oh, my God, absolutely. As a matter of fact, I have a cookbook out. It's called the 420 Gourmet, and it teaches you how to make everything from, of course, cookies and brownies, but to things like hazy Thai wings, which is my take on Thai street wings, or how to make, mac and cheese, how to make, your favorite holiday dinner. We fiesta dinner in there, which is, Oaxacan. Basically, it's a Mexican fiesta. And how do you incorporate cannabis into a meal like that, or Thanksgiving? Or we even have a recipe in there for a pat shabbat, which incorporates cannabis into the matzo balls. They call them pasta balls, and they have like a pasta ball soup. So you can pretty much, once you learn how to cook with cannabis and you learn the nuances of the ingredients you're using, anything that you can make with butter, oil, tinctures, and if you know how to infuse sugar, or with sugars, you can make anything you want with it. There's a whole wealth of recipes out there that can totally be, I like to say, cannabis.
Nice. I like the matzo ball idea. It reminds me of a good spin-off of the way that Grandmommy used to always make them.
Yeah. Let me tell you, as I say, I think in the cookbook, these are not your mom's or grandma's matzo balls. The grandma's sure going to love them.
You mentioned some of the recipes in your cookbook. What are some of your favorite recipes from the 420 Gourmet cookbook?
I think I mentioned my favorite ones. I mean, that's why I mentioned them. My hazy Thai wings are a huge crowd favorite every time we do a dinner party. And we do a lot of celebrity dinner parties and private dinner parties and corporate dinner parties and stuff. And hazy Thai wings is always on the menu. My Canna apple roses, which are little apple pastries that look like roses. We have those at every event that we do. You know, some of the other favorites that are, you know, one-off that people like are like the mac and cheese, have stone pepper noodle pudding, which is pretty awesome. Which is, I don't know if you know what a kugel is. You know, it's Jewish food, but basically a take on a kugel. It's a very famous Jerusalem kugel, and I picked it up a couple notches.
Very nice. Do you think there's a stigma about cooking with cannabis?
I don't think there's much of a stigma as much as a fear. People, they would love to be able to do it if they could, but it can be scary. First, you know, the first thing is obviously the taste, and a lot of people don't like that taste. Even more importantly is how potent are the edibles that you make. So, you know, the one thing that I was challenged with early on is trying to figure out how do I make sure that I know exactly how potent each serving of an edible is, or each serving of a dessert is. If I'm serving, for example, my wings, how many milligrams is each of those wings? And we have to make sure that obviously they're very low dose. I tend to lean towards layered microdosing. Really what that does is we serve small doses in each item. So that by the end of a meal, let's say you'll have 10 or 15 milligrams, and that's really the perfect dosage for most people. Some people are even great with 5 milligrams of THC. I would say 10 milligrams of THC will make you feel like you had about 2 or 3 glasses of wine on an empty stomach. And that's for most people. That's not for people, you know, who are used to eating cannabis infused edibles or have a higher tolerance. 10 milligrams seems to be the sweet spot for most people. And finding out how to dose your edibles is a big challenge. And my cookbook actually teaches you how to figure out how potent your edibles are, and then how to figure out how to dose your edibles so that you get the proper dosage per serving so you and your guests will have a great experience.
And a quick word from our sponsors. Besides the dosage amount and maybe having too much of that weedy taste, is there another common mistake that you see people making when they're cooking with cannabis?
Yeah, one common mistake I see is people just grind their weed and throw it into their recipe, which is wrong. It doesn't work that way. I mean, it could work that way, but it pretty much tastes gross. You know, I mean, I when I first started out, I mean, I did that. Then I realized, all right, even though it kind of works because the heat will actually decarboxylate the cannabis when it's cooking, it just tastes terrible unless you really know what you're doing. Now what I do when I actually cook with cannabis, with the leaves, the flower, I'll incorporate them into a recipe where they actually add and provide taste as well as the medicines. If I'm cooking, for example, my lasagna, my spinach lasagna, I will incorporate fan leaves and sugar leaves into the lasagna with the spinach. And what that does, you know, because of the way that it's processed and the way that it's baked in the oven, it doesn't get to that temperature where the terpenes are burnt off. But because they're inside of lasagna, the inside of lasagna doesn't get hot enough to burn off most of the terpenes, but just enough to infuse those flavors into the food. So you get a really nice taste. You can, that same mistake that I made way back when, I figured out how to do it properly, and that you actually can do it, but you have to take into consideration the characteristics of the plant.
And do you have any other tips for those who are looking to cook with cannabis?
Yeah, so there's several. I would say, you know, the first thing is understand what you're working with, understand the plant. Also understand the characteristics of the compounds in the plant. So terpenes, for example, are a very important part of that plant. However, when you burn those terpenes off, they don't do anybody any good. For most people who are cooking with cannabis, they're going to burn the terpenes off when they're making the butters or oils. The terpenes are not going to help anybody. That's why I remove them in the. And by the way, in my cookbook, I teach you how to remove the majority of those compounds, and I teach you how to make a light-tasting canna oil or canna butter, because those terpenes aren't going to do anybody any good when they're burnt off. So it's a lot better to be able to cook with cannabis that doesn't have all that weedy taste in the burnt terpenes, and you can have a much more enjoyable edible experience. So, you know, that's one tip. And like I said, I teach you how to do that in the cookbook. Another thing is understand what dosing is and understand what milligrams per serving is. 5 milligrams is a great starting point, and a lot of people who are not used to eating edibles or cooking with edibles, 5 milligrams is a really nice starting point. Most people are fine with 10 milligrams. You don't have to go overboard. Just completely load up your meal with a ton of THC. And the third thing is you can use your canna oil and canna butter sparingly and only as an add-in or addition to a replacement for the butter or oil using in a recipe. So if I'm making a batch of chocolates or cookies and I only want those cookies to be, let's say, 1.5 milligrams each or 2 milligrams each because I want to eat more than one cookie, I only have to use, let's say, 2 tablespoons of canna butter, and then the rest of the butter can be plain butter. So I can mix canna butter with regular butter or canna oil with regular oil in my recipes and you can mix the two.
Perfect. Those are some very helpful tips. What do you have to say for those that are still on the fence about cooking with cannabis?
I wouldn't want to rush anybody into it, but if you're interested in cooking with cannabis, learn about it first and understand it. I think when you start to learn about plants as an ingredient and understand what the compounds in the plant have, what the plant does, you shouldn't be afraid and just go for it. There's plenty of places to learn how to do it. I'm not the only one who teaches how to cook with cannabis, although I am the only one that teaches you how to make a light-tasting cannabis oil or cannabis butter, or, my cookbook is the only cookbook out there that tells you the dosing in the recipe per serving if you follow the instructions. If you finally feel confident with the tools at your disposal to actually cook with cannabis, then it's really easy. But if you're on the fence, do your research until you feel comfortable.
And as mentioned earlier, the 420 Gourmet is a great place to start learning to cook with cannabis. But Jeff, the 420 Chef, are you ready for the Final Four?
I'm ready for the Final Four. Hit me.
What food city are you dying to go to that you haven't been to yet?
Oh, wow. I'm going to say Prague. Yep, there's a Michelin restaurant that I really want to try out there.
What's the hardest meal for you to pass up when you're out to dinner?
Mac and cheese and fried chicken. Mac and cheese and fried chicken. Those are I can't pass those up. I usually get them at the same time.
That's a great combo.
Yeah.
What's the most exotic dish you've eaten?
The most exotic dish I've eaten was when I was in South Africa, and I ate giraffe.
Wow.
Yeah, giraffe and ostrich. I had both of those. That was crazy.
If people want to learn more about you and your cookbook, the 420 Gourmet, where can they find that information?
So Instagram is the best place. So JeffThe420Chef at Instagram. The cookbook is sold on Amazon as well as through my website, which is JeffThe420Chef.com. If you order from the website, I will sign and personalize a copy before we send it. Pretty much you can also reach us through Facebook, anywhere that you just, any social media channel, just type in JeffThe420Chef and you can get me. But Instagram is the best place.
Perfect. And all of those links will be on the episode description below. Jeff, the 420 Chef, thank you so much for joining me on the I'd Eat That podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a lot of fun.
Big thanks to Jeff, the 420 Chef, for joining me today. If you enjoyed what you heard, please subscribe to this podcast. For additional content, please follow us on Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, and Curate. Next week, we'll have Food Network celebrity chef, Chef Stu, joining us on the podcast. He's the founder of the Transition Kitchen Foundation that helps people in poverty learn cooking and other transferable skills. I will see you next week on the I'd Eat That podcast.